So welcome to the first section of the course. Some materials that I put together, which I hope, are an interesting mix of statements and attitudes towards death, which is really all this course is about. Your job is to think about them and to come up with a response paper, a brief response paper of 250 words, which is about a page, in which you express an idea, an attitude, a point of view on either the collection of materials as a whole for the readings, or one part of them. You don't have to try to talk about everything. The only important thing is that you express a thought, and you express it clearly, an opinion, a thought, and you give your reasons briefly. It shouldn't just be a collection of unconnected statements. It should be a nice little polished piece of work. But how you respond to these things is entirely up to you. These videos that I'll be doing for every section are just my thoughts on the things that I've chosen for you to look at, why I chose them, why I think they're interesting, maybe suggest a few connections and contrasts here and there, but ultimately, obviously, it is up to you to make sense of them. I like Game of Thrones. At least I used to like it. I think it was extremely interesting imagined world to be introduced to when I began watching the show, and I've included a little favorite of mine that I found on YouTube of a scene between a young girl, character in the show, and her fencing master, who's teaching her how to fight with swords, but is also teaching her about life. And they have a wonderful little exchange in which he tells her that there is only one God, and his name is death. Well, I find that an extremely interesting conception of death. I'm no expert on the world of Game of Thrones, of the Song of Ice and Fire, but my understanding, at least from the first couple of seasons, was that in this imaginary world, with these imaginary people and their imaginary culture and their imaginary religion, that they are extremely religious people. They believe in gods, they're polytheistic, but they don't believe in an afterlife. And that's not entirely unrealistic. There are certainly major religions of the world which don't really have a notion of the afterlife, or at least it's not emphasized, life after death, as being a terribly important thing. That may seem strange to a Christian or a Muslim, in which the afterlife, the notions of heaven and hell, are very well developed and very important for the faith, but not all faiths are like that. And I find it extremely interesting that in such a situation, in which we view our lives as finite, as coming to an utter and absolute end, that death may be viewed as a god, having a sort of ultimate power over us. That if we think about, say, the Judeo-Christian Muslim notion of a monotheistic God who is all-powerful and all-knowing and good, that notion of God having the ultimate power over the universe as the creator and sustainer of the universe, that in the absence of such a conception of the deity, one may think of death as being an alternative for having that sort of power over us, that ultimate power. If we think of death as a force, perhaps, that wipes us out, that it's that God that we need to appease, at least in that world. And I thought that was extremely interesting. I suppose I included it because I wanted to start with John Donne's famous sonnet, Death Be Not Proud, in which an entirely different view of death, and I would say a completely contrasting and incompatible view of death, is presented. One of the holy sonnets, the so-called Death Be Not Proud sonnet. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. And certainly the supposition from the little clip from Game of Thrones is that death is mighty and dreadful. It has the ultimate power over us. And what's really interesting about Donne's poem, which is a thoroughly Christian poem as far as I'm concerned, it makes no sense unless you think about it being written by a Christian, is that death is not that at all. It has no power over us. Though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, thou art not, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death. Nor yet canst thou kill me. And certainly that only makes sense if we have a certain view of what me, you, we are, because certainly death does kill us in terms of our earthly existence, our bodily existence. But if you have a notion of yourself which transcends the body, which certainly does die, something like the soul or your spirit or your personality, then death becomes a powerless thing, because that cannot be killed. So Donne's poem, which again I think can only be read as in a specifically Christian religious context, becomes kind of the opposite view from the fencing master's view that the only God is death, that there's nothing godlike about death. Death is nothing to the Christian, or to anyone who believes that there's an eternal part of themselves which is destined for a future beyond death. Death becomes a paltry thing. He says at the end there, what is death but a short sleep? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. And that's a very interesting, again, I think specifically Christian view of things, as Christ as the ultimate victor over death, as the ultimate giver of life, not bodily life, but an eternal life, dying into life. Very interesting contrast. Finally, I included something from the Bible that I thought was interesting. Couldn't help but be interesting, because it's from the book of Ecclesiastes, which is not really the content of which is very surprising. If you've ever read Ecclesiastes, part of the Old Testament, part of the so-called wisdom books of the Old Testament, whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or just interested in world religions, it's a very, very interesting text, because it is so different from most of what we read in the Bible. I mean, people have a notion of what's supposed to be in the Bible, but they don't read the Bible very much, so they have a mistaken notion. The truth is there's all sorts of attitudes and all sorts of things in the Bible, viewpoints about human existence and views of the nature of God. And here, this brief excerpt from Ecclesiastes I chose because it is about death and about our death, and about, well, let's look at it. The preacher, the speaker of Ecclesiastes says, "As for humans, God tests them, so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward, and if the spirit of the animals goes down into the earth?" Amazing view. I mean, not just because it's in the Bible. We think that the Bible doesn't say things like that. Just in itself, this viewpoint that human beings are animals, and our fate is the same as the animals, and that we are made of dust, and to dust we shall return, and that's it, man. That's it. We have no reason to think that we are any better than the animals, that our spirit somehow rises upward to some new fate, and there it just goes down and becomes the dust of the earth. It's obvious that the speaker of Ecclesiastes is pretty, well, as sure as you can be, that we die like the animals. And for that reason he thinks everything is meaningless. We live this short time on the earth, and it's all the time we have, and then it's taken away. And one wonders what it was all for. I guess we just, as he continually says in Ecclesiastes, you just have to work and get involved. You have to work and eat and drink and be merry when you can, for tomorrow we shall die. But that comes from another source, but that seems to be close. So just I just wanted to give you some three very, I think, very strong attitudes towards the nature of death. And very interesting to think of together, and but you make of it what you will. You look at those things and read those things, and you come up with your own response.